Repeat after me. Memphis. Let it sink into your chest. Memphis. Let it sink into your chest. Mobilizing equity through music and our policy, understanding history so we can make a change. Mobilizing equity through music and our policy, understanding history so we can make a change, Memphis. Then it goes into story is our art. Story is our music. Breaking culture down so we know how they do that. Story is the art we share. Story is for all to bear. Story is the human way to listen just to know you care. Memphis. Let it sink into your chest. Memphis. Let it sink into your chest. I know a place where ain't nobody crying and ain't nobody worried, y'all, and ain't no smiling faces lying to the races. Oh, help me. Help me now. Let me see, get out of your seats, move a little bit. Help me now. All right, let me see you move a little bit, feel the groove. All right now. Yeah, Memphis, only in Memphis. All right, let's take it one more time, and this I want to hear you actually sing the I'll Take You There part. Here we go. I know a place, all right now, where ain't nobody crying and ain't nobody worried, y'all, and ain't no smiling faces lying to the races. Oh yeah, I'll take you there. Let me hear it. I'll take you there. All right, I'll take you there. All right, give it up. Groove is a cultural genius. Give it up for the band, y'all. Because that's the cultural genius. Groove is the cultural genius. It's the way that we measure time. It's a snapshot. We measure time through fusing melody and rhythm and syncopation with each other. It's a form of communication. It takes us to another place. It transports us. It transports us sometimes to the future. Sometimes it takes us back. Sense memory, all of those things exist within groove. So as soon as you hear ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-dum, right? Yep. Every time. It don't matter if you're in a bad mood. You be a good mood, but you find that joy in that moment to be like, okay, now. Yeah. That's been my experience in Memphis. It's been really an awesome ride. And part of what I want to talk about today, right, is the fusion between Mavis and Martin. 1972, Staple Singers put out that hit. But what I bet you didn't know is where it was recorded. It was recorded in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Al Bell is the one who produced it. Now, before King passed 4 years prior, the Staple Singers said, if King can preach it, then we can sing it. And so in many ways, what you have with that song is the manifestation of King's dream. I'll take you there. That's significant. part of today, when we're looking at defining the new normal, equity in motion, it's about narrative, it's about joy, it's about justice, it's about white supremacy, it's about whiteness, it's about blackness, it's about all of these things that are fused into one space. And often that can exist in one groove, all of those things that we just named, justice, love, faith, all of that. But equity in motion is about how we embody it. Equity in motion is the act of being. Culture is how we share place and time. Or how I like to say, ebonically stated, geniusly stated, is how we be. Not how we are, because it's the act of actually being and doing something. Equity requires activity. It's a verb you have to do. You have to do something. It's not something we're reaching for. It's now. So defining the new normal, and we look at this story, Al Bell, part of equity is saying, how do we step back and we ask the question, what do you think? What's the question? Why? Equity is about how a community is better off. Why was it like that in the first place? That is a significant question in defining the new normal. What COVID taught us is where all of the gaps were in our system. And all of the protests that happened because people began to see what they already felt. And it became real. And it became even realer. So when we look at the story of how this song was created, I always wonder, well, why was it recorded in Muscle Shoals, Alabama? Al Bell had to produce a hit. This was after Jim and Estelle Axton. For those who don't know, Stax, which I know we all do here, right? But Stax would be seen as the Motown of the South, or we could say Motown is the Stax of the North narrative, right? Yeah. But Al Bell took them down to Muscle Shoals for several reasons. One, there's this narrative that I always hear around like, well, you know, Stax music, like that's black and that's white. And it's all of those things. Or you hear another narrative that says, well, Stax, you know, we didn't see in black and white. We only saw in the blues. I said, are you saying 4 years after 1968? Really? After one of the most legendary figures was assassinated? What I'm getting at is the narrative. That narrative comes from a set of values that suggest either or. But what I'm throwing out is a new narrative that says both and, where multiple truths can be held in existence in one place and one container. So where it is that they saw in black and white, and they made a choice. And they made a choice to find joy in those moments. That's the narrative. We're missing narrative a lot of times in the work that we're doing because we are running and we are stepping away from truthing and grounding us in truth. And there's a lot of fear around the conversation when we say white and whiteness and blackness and white supremacy. And what's the invert of that? There's fear around it. I had fear even preparing this conversation, saying, how am I going to enter into this conversation right now? Because we're not necessarily ready to grapple with it, but time is saying that we have to. We have to. So defining the new normal equity in motion is about that. So Al Bell goes down to Muscle Shoals. And he takes it away from either or thinking into both and. The other thing that we have from this certain skill set around white supremacy and the values is worship of the written word. What is dynamic about Al Bell is that he didn't have a traditional education. So we had somebody just talking about education. Al Bell was a genius because he was DJing on the records for decades and decades and heard all these rhythms and syncopations and grooves, cultural genius in terms of how it comes together. What he did was he took a beat from Jamaica, the Liquidators, turned 4 lines into a hit that everybody celebrates around the world. And so many times, if we left it to what it looked like on paper, what his accolades were on paper, we would not celebrate the genius that he is. That's a step away from white supremacy as well. Worship of the written word, but honoring the oral traditions. Because he went to Muscle Shoals because he had to, in Toni Morrison's words, escape the white gaze. White gaze is about perfectionism, right? All of these things that are mixed in. He didn't feel comfortable creating. Any artist out there knows you have to have a safe space to create in. So 4 years after King had passed and they had to produce this hit, he decided he wasn't going to speed up, get the deliverables done, the grind, right? He decided that he was going to slow down and build capacity and build trust with the artist because they had never worked together before. As a result, they had hit after hit where the staple singers started to tap into the groove, that groove that we just felt that makes everybody want to get up and dance. That's important because this process is about engagement, embodiment that equals equitable access. So the engagement can be described quite simply. 2 E's equals 1 big E. Engagement often should be seen as a spectrum. Some folks say outreach, and they use them interchangeably. But what I throw out there is that outreach is where it starts. Outreach is when you go into a community and says, this is what I offer. This is what we have. These are the direct services that we have. Do you want it? Access says, this is what I have. This is what I offer. We'll bring access. We'll bring you for free. We'll offer it for free. Engagement says, this is what I have. Do you want it? We'll bring it. And ask, well, what is it that you want? Engagement asks and engages so it's a conversation where the community is able to prioritize. Then authentic engagement is a series of conversations that happen because we should assume, as usual, when people first meet that they may not necessarily say all the things that are on their mind and that people can be guarded, that it takes relationship to get the authentic side of what it is that they desire. And then after you have the truth, and the authentic side, organizing suggests that you ask the question, what is it that you want to do, and what are the barriers from keeping you from doing it? And then organizing suggests that you bring people together and connect them so that they can address those things. So often organizing is seen as a negative thing, but it's a beautiful thing. It's a story about survival, and it's a story about resiliency, how people come together, how we bring bridges together between residents and institutions. And it shouldn't be seen as an antagonistic process. It should be seen as a birth, a rebirth. Part of equitable access is not just dismantling the systems that we are in. It's about bearing new systems, using radical imagination to create that. So many who embody equitable practices lack the resources to engage, and those who have the resources to engage lack the equitable embodiment. I'll say that again. Many who embody the equitable practices will say that the equitable practices are the place where Mavis Staples says, I'll take you there, the equity space. And we'll say that many people who embody the there practices lack the resources to engage. And many who are in the here lack the equitable embodiment. 3 years ago, MLK 50 celebration, and the question going around the city was, well, where do we go from here? Well, my question and my Control-Alt-Delete is, well, what is here? We have to start defining what here is so that we can go there. If you don't know where you're coming from, anybody can come in and tell you who you are. We have to have that conversation. We have to unpack that. That's our nation's philanthropic conundrum. E plus E equals E. But we can't figure out how to get federal, state, right, philanthropic resources into the community, to the people that are doing the work, where they have the infrastructure. And it's not an overcomplicated thing. It's just a choice. So the embodiment piece. We talked about engagement, the embodiment piece. Embodiment is about cultural genius. What we just saw, meeting people where they are. Audrey Jordan says that it's about the mind, heart, and spirit. And that there's all of these things that happen in the mind, which we would call quantitative space. And as we move to the heart and spirit, that will be qualitative. Stories. Story is our art. Story is our music. Breaking culture down so we know how they do it. Story is the light we share. Story is for all to bear. Story is the human way to listen, just to know that you care. So the cultural genius moves us from mind, heart, and to the spirit. That allows for us to go to a feelings, the groove. That allows for us to go into the spiritual, ancestors. It's important. The ancestry part is important, and we'll tap on that in a minute, because for those who've been disconnected, to be able to call upon that is a manifestation in itself. See, dominant culture operates in the mind. It says that it's been separated and that knowing our heart and intuitive and spiritual knowing is a space that's under the iceberg. At the top of the iceberg is what we always see. but we haven't taken the time to explore the cultural genius that exists under the iceberg. So this mothership, George Clinton, Funk, right? He takes us to the future. He takes us to the past. We're in groove. We're talking about joy, justice, themes around liberation, all of these things in one snapshot, in one beat. I went out to Oakland, California just a couple weeks ago to see the exhibit. They had an anonymous donation of $30 million to support cultural activity. And one of the things that they produced was an exhibit on Afrofuturism. And in that, you'll see this image. And it was so incredible because so often we don't get to have the conversation from an ancestral, from the intuitive space. We spend our time in our workspaces only dealing with the top of what our talent is and not engaging in a whole other space that brings us joy. How many of us know the difference between joy and happiness? Talk to me. Happiness depends on what's happening. Yes. Happiness is something that we see on the face. Joy is something that we feel here. Joy is something that is a choice, which is why we can find joy in unhappy circumstances, but we can't find happiness in unhappy circumstances. People who have had a challenge understand that journey because that journey takes you on a journey of the self. That is in part of the cultural genius that needs to exist. That is a part of the process that links us from the here to the there, from white supremacy into where we're going, equitable access. And there's a process that takes us there. That process is what I would call black joy. Let me say, black joy. Yes. 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 Which is why I love living in Memphis, a chocolate city. Yes. 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 Be happy about that. Yes. While there's a strident history, there's so much opportunity. There's so much opportunity to go under the iceberg. See, we have to be amphibious. It requires us to be able to stay underwater for a long time and explore what's there. So there's 4 frequencies to black joy. There is self-love. This is also taken from Audrey Jordan's Measuring Love. Self-love is the work that we do, self-care. We heard somebody talking about grind. It's the self-care piece. Self-care as a form of resistance, to make sure that you are in congruence with your own core values, to be able to ask the question, why? Why did this happen? Why did I act this way? And so often, we don't take the time to actually do that in the workspace. And so we have trauma after trigger, after trigger, after trauma, after trigger, after activator, and then we wonder why people go crazy. Self-care is something that we have to instill in the workforce, in our churches, every part of American life. And it's something that has been denied to people of color for generation after generation. Love for others. Simple. Love with a deep humility. Listening. Being able to listen and really hear and engage. That's all it is. And then being able to make a mistake and it be okay, and that everything's going to move forward and there's no shame. Not that we get fired. Because the mistakes do happen. And capacity building is training so that they don't happen. Love as a community practice. This is the part of black joy for me that really, really resonates. And we see it. And so I listed some examples of the music that you can find it in, right? But love as a community practice is how we come together collectively. It's a beautiful thing at the barbecue, at church. And the last one is love fused with power. And MLK talks about that. Fused with power, where we have the ability to materialize our own existence and materialize our own power, and where we have conversations that dive into collective liberation. Some of us, well, what's collective liberation? Where all of us have access. That is a process and should not be seen as an identity. Black joy is something we all can experience, and it takes time, and it's something that can be embodied in the workforce, organizational culture, institutional culture, and across the city. So once we get there and we realize that part of what the process of black joy is not about dismantling all of the inequitable practices, it's just about building something new. The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on the fighting the old, but on building the new, Socrates. So once we establish that and move into that space, we have to understand that what we're doing, and I love this diagram that you see, roots of power building, sustainability, and evolution, because it takes it into a space of being generative, because it's two plants, and it shows one plant is larger than the other. That means the one that's smaller is in a more emergent space and still developing its practices. And the larger one, it's big. It has the ability to share power. That's part of the Black joy experience. So at the very top of the soil, it's about building infrastructure. In some neighborhoods, and for those who don't know, I run a nonprofit that does this kind of work, where we're doing, I call it a nonprofit social equity firm, but we do a lot of organizing on the ground. And part of that is assessing in the neighborhoods how much power has been ceded, how much has been extracted, where there's been activity to organize, and how they connect. And neighborhoods are in different areas. But once you establish that, then you have to establish where's the hub going to be. Sometimes it's one hub, sometimes it's multiple hubs. Then you go deeper into the soil where it talks about narrative, the narrative that we talked about earlier. Narrative allows for us to have new practices. The data is the same. What creates a new narrative is a new story. Narrative is data plus story. Get new stories and we get new narrative because we're getting deeper into the soil to find the stories. Then we get to a part where we have an analysis around power and racial equity because we've done the work, the Black joy process that allows for us to assess individually how we identify. Individually, as individuals, white, Black. What is our own power analysis and how should we enter into a situation? And the last is how do we collectively share that? So what does that all mean? Equitable access, quite simply, is about building cultural power, centering culture. And cultural power can be described by three spaces. Narrative power, having access to claim your own narrative and agency in that process, to having the resources to sustain it, to having access and representation in the systems that serve us. And they go back and forth, and they're braided together to create cultural power, especially for communities of color. So how is it measured? At the end of the day, we have to be able to assess that we are moving from a space of unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence. Unconscious incompetence is basically, I don't know what I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. Conscious incompetence is, I learned about it, but I still don't get it. Conscious competence is, I get it, and now I'm practicing it. And unconscious competence is, I've been practicing it and practicing it, and now I'm just doing, and I got Black joy, and I'm happy because that process continues to unfold, where I'm able to be happy despite my circumstances. So what I want to leave you with are a few images. And one of the songs that was listed under love of care for others. Otis Redding's Try a Little Tenderness is a beautiful example of how melody comes together with rhythm in a very simple way to just simply share tender moments of love. Oh, we may be weary, us young ones, we do get weary, wearing them same old shaggy dress, yeah. And when we get weary, try a little tenderness. You know you've been waiting, anticipating for the things you never, never, never will possess. But when you get weary, when you get weary, when you get weary, try a little tenderness. Thank you.